My name is Stephanie Singer. I am with the Nature Conservancy and I work with the Ohio Sustainable Agriculture team. So excited to have you all here for our webinar. We are really excited to be celebrating Ohio Soil Health Week. It's the first ever Soil Health Week in Ohio. It's going on, it started on November 10th all the way through the 16th, and there's many really amazing events. I will put a link in the chat so you can check out those other events, but we're happy to be here for the next hour. The format of this webinar will be for the first 50 minutes. We have Dani Kusner. She is a CCA. She's going to be giving us a presentation on the intersection of biomes, both soil and human health. At the very end of the webinar, for the last 10 minutes, we'll open it up to questions for Dani. So if you have questions, please save them to the end and we'll be happy to answer them. I'd like to welcome Dani. She gave this presentation, or a version of this presentation, at a field day at Matt Burkholder's this summer, and I was really impressed, and I think the others there were also. So she's bringing a really unique perspective. She is with Deep Soil LLC. She is a certified crop advisor, like I said. She is trained with the Train Advocate through the Metabolic Train Institute of Health. She earned a degree in sustainable studies from the University of Dayton. And since then, she's been on a journey to transform soils and food production through people's connection with Mother Earth. So welcome, Dani. Great to have you here today. And please begin your presentation.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Stephanie. And while I can't see anybody's face because I'm in presenter mode, I just want to have a warm welcome to everybody. I'm excited to be here, and I hope you get something of value from my presentation today. So thanks for such a great introduction, Stephanie. I'll just jump in. Do have a brief medical disclaimer slide here. I will be talking about health topics, but I'm not a medical professional, so technically don't take anything that I say seriously. My training was with the Metabolic Train Institute of Health, which is Dr. Nasha Winter's organization. She wrote a book called The Metabolic Approach to Cancer, which could be considered kind of the metabolic approach to life, and that's where I base a lot of my human health information off of. So just a little bit about me and my background. That was a great intro from Stephanie, but want to share a little of my journey. That I'm a certified crop advisor. I'm an agronomist by training. So I work with farmers to help them grow their crops, do a lot with soil nutrient balancing. And I don't know what the blend of folks are on the call today in terms of if you're coming from a farmer crowd or maybe more so consumer interest or just personal interest and environmental interest. But about 5 years ago, I began to see the connection between soil health and human health and how all of these things are connected. And it's taken me on a deeper journey into these topics that I just can't talk to farmers about soil health from the I guess the basics of like cover crops, and crop rotation and minimizing tillage and some of the soil health principles that maybe those on the call have heard about before, that there really is this deeper listening that I'm doing about how our culture and our choices as a culture and society are influencing Mother Nature and these microbiomes, the biology that's underpinning everything at a really interesting level, an intricate level that we normally don't think about. So part of my role now as a consultant and someone who works with farmers and people with their personal health is really to listen and try to help others listen really deeply. And in order to listen, I like to ground us in humility. It's very interesting that the Latin root of humility is this hum, or H-U-M, hume, which means of the earth, or kind of lowly and close to the ground. So as we're talking about the soil microbiome and how our human connection, our human microbiome is actually of or from the soil, I love to bring in this word humility. And also it helps to ground me that I don't have all the answers. We're actively figuring this out together as on a as a society in all different levels of, from the farmers to the medical practitioners to the consumers. We need all voices and all people to start thinking about the importance of the microbiome. So we listen with humility. And my third kind of grounding slide is that we listen from all three brains. So some people don't realize that we have our brain in our head, right? That we think, okay, is that the mind? Where does the mind really live or exist? And there's other brains in our body. The gut, if you guys can see my pointer slide, the gut and the digestion microbiome is considered its own brain, as well as the heart. And so this yellow is the vagus nerve that's connecting all three of these brains all the way up to the human brain. And so as we get into these topics that may be a little unconventional than just talking about like the 5 principles of soil health, we want to start listening from all three brains and really realizing that our microbiology is actually in all of these systems, as it's throughout our human body. We have microbes in our heart. We have a lot of microbes in our gut microbiome. So with that, we'll kind of jump into the roadmap, which is I'm gonna introduce these 2 microbiomes, both soil and human. Going to focus a little bit on how they're disappearing. Hope not to get too deep there, but it is important to know kind of the trajectory that we're on, and how much the microbiome is being disturbed right now. And then we'll end with solutions. So I like to begin with a little bit of the really, really big picture. And I know I can't see you guys, but I like to talk with my hands. This is something, evolution, or the trajectory of like this little globe that we're on, planet Earth, right? Where did life begin? And life began in the water, but how did we get out of the water and onto land? And I like to remind us that this came from the microbiology. It was actually the relationship between an algae connecting with a fungal hyphae that created a lichen. And it was lichens that then grew up on these rocks and began to take life out of the water and onto land. So that relationship between the algae and the fungi, which was discovered in 1885, was the first example of a symbiotic relationship. So 2 different organisms working together to kind of create a completely new organism, and symbiosis being the one part or a basis of like a collaboration, or nature collaborating as a theory of how life has evolved, rather than the Darwin theory, right, of like survival of the fittest, and that this is all about competition. So I like to go with symbiosis and collaboration, and reminding us that this microbiology, which actually, if we start here at the bottom, call it the birth of the earth 400,000 years ago, it was these bacteria. We start on this side of the picture here, and each branch in this evolutionary chart is when there was a split or a change in the species. And you see that wraps all the way around with all life on planet Earth, all the way down to humans, way over here on the far right. So bacteria got onto land, and then there are plants and fungi, and then the basis of all the animal kingdoms, all the way down to humans. So we really are microbes, and remembering this as the basis of, there's microbes in the soil. We're going to talk about the soil microbiome, but we as humans are kind of these super organisms, it's been called, of microbial life. Microbial life just keeps evolving into more complex life forms. So we're interconnected, we're interdependent. How can we think of ourselves as multitudes rather than individuals? and recognizing that these, really, really little microbes, right, the bacteria and the fungi and the viruses and the nematodes and the protozoa that are both in soil as well as in our human bodies are what's, protecting us and priming our immune system, as well as shaping everything from like our cognitive function and our decision making all the way to like our moods and our feelings and how we're functioning throughout the day. So I'm going to start with soil in terms of I'm going to go a little bit back and forth between soil and human microbiome. And I'm going to start here with the soil. So air, water, earth, and fire, considered, these 4 elements on planet Earth. I would argue that pretty much any living thing has some aspect of all 4 of these in them. And I'm taking some liberty here to say that the fire is the microbes and the microbial energy or life that is driving something that is living, right? So within soil, if you guys have seen this pie chart, soil is comprised of 25% air, 25% water, approximately 45% mineral, and then it's this 5% sliver that's organic matter. So if we take the microorganisms, which are just 10% of organic matter, that's only 0.5% of soil is actually this microbial biomass, right? But what I would argue is that it's these microbes that are responsible for all functioning of that soil system. So this is a graphic from Decode 6, which kind of gives just a nice breakdown of these main functions of the microbes in the soil. So decomposition of old plant material. If we didn't have microbes, nothing would ever kind of break down and turn into compost or turn into soil. We would just have piles and piles of stuff that would never go away. They cycle nutrients and make those available. They build the soil. So any conversation about organic matter or carbon sequestration, that's a microbial driven process. The microbes are building the structure and the aggregation, and it's actually, I like to think of soil aggregates as like the house. Who doesn't want a nice house, right? So that the microbes want to build a nice house for themselves. Microbes are responsible for disease suppression and immune regulation of the soil system and the plant system. Phytohormone production, think about this as, similar to like hormones in the body, right? There's hormones that are in a plant or a natural growing system. They're not called adrenaline or some of our human hormone names, but there are hormones in the plant systems, and the microbes help to regulate and produce those. They form the symbiotic relationship with plants, and they also can do things such as regulate or mitigate things like a high salt environment or a heavy metal environment. Microbes can help, clean up the soil. So lots of different functions. And I'm going to jump over the human here. That's like, okay, well, what's the comparison in the human body of the microbiome? So the human body, we're made up of about 60% water and 16% protein and 16% fat and 6% mineral. And the microbes aren't on this slide, but what's not accounted for is we have all these microbes. We have microbe cells that actually outnumber human cells 10 to 1. And in terms of genetic material, the microbes outnumber human genetic material 100 to 1. I mean, when I really sit with this, it's quite profound, right? It's like, are we really human, or are we really microbial? And then it's this microbial system in my body, that's really controlling and regulating everything, right? So how much am I, Dani, really in control here? Is it more of the microbes in control? So 90% of all disease can be traced back in some way to the gut and the health of this microbiome. So I'm going to go a little deeper dive in a few other slides about the human microbiome, but this is just an introduction here. Without these microbes, either in soil or for people, it's really like we're on the drip IV. In soil, this is where, say, the nutrient cycling, if the microbes aren't there to make plant available nutrition and there's a really healthy, robust amount of organic matter to draw from, we have to use our synthetic, nutrients or synthetic chemicals to help control that growing environment and provide the nutrition to it. This is a drip irrigation, but I mean, this could be any commodity crop farm field. I shouldn't say any, but I should say most that I work with are conventional farmers that are trying to shift in some way to a regenerative practice or improve upon their management in some way so that we're less reliant on synthetic fertilizers and chemistries. And then, when we're on a drip IV in the hospital, if we get that sick, right, we're being fed nutrients and liquids that our bodies can't provide for themselves at that point because we're in such a dire state. So flipping back to the soil and how these little, I like to call them, the little critters or the little bugs work. These are all invisible to our eyes for the most part. They're divided up into these trophic levels. So they kind of fall in line here, these columns with the different trophic levels on the bottom. And a lot of people might be familiar with bacteria and fungi, but this is just the first trophic level. And then we need higher levels such as protozoa and nematodes. They need adequate amounts of the fungi and bacteria to eat. They actually, would use this as a food source and then cycle nutrients from there as they're building into maybe, bigger nematodes or bigger arthropods. So we need multiple trophic levels, which you'll hear me say diversity, again and again in this presentation. And when I say diversity with the soil microbiome, it's trying to build these higher levels of the trophic levels. I use this fat of the land here because John Kempf has given a number from his research that 40% of humic substances, which humic substances are a large portion of what makes stable organic matter, are these phospholipid fatty acid, the cell membranes of these microbes. So this is actually how we measure like a microbial biomass in the soil is through a PLFA or a fatty acid PLFA, fatty acid. Sorry guys, I'm losing my train of thought here. Fatty acid sorry, that was the word I was forgetting. Fatty acid phospholipid. So we're able to measure the microbial biomass by, they just measure what those phospholipid layers are in the soil. And those are the remnants from the bacteria and the fungi. And so it's interesting, the fat of the land really is, and stable organic matter really is the dead bodies of the microbes that are able to recycle and keep nutrients in a stable form for later use by like a plant uptake or a crop uptake. And as a quick refresher here, how does all this work in terms of the microbes really building up plant nutrition and then affecting to the human microbiome? These plants take in CO2 from the air and water and sunlight through photosynthesis. They use that to build carbohydrates, or what I like to think of as simple sugars or root exudates. You might hear that term, and they push them to the roots. And we would think, how is it that a plant wants to give away 1/3 to 50% of its energy to its root system? And that is to feed the microbial biomass in the soil. So the microbes are down there and they're exchanging with the roots. They come to get those root exudates in exchange for something else. And then the microbes, just like humans, they breathe in oxygen and release CO2. So the CO2 respires and it kind of comes up, and the ideal cycle would be that it gets taken right back into the plant leaf tissue, you know, the stomata on the underside of the leaf can suck in that CO2 and just have a really quick, tight cycle of photosynthesis. Some people call this the photosynthetic engine, so that everything's just recycled right there within the plant system. Now, what's happening with the root exudates at the root surface is here we have this root. So just take any root, and this is, you know, a picture just showing different microbial species, Azotobacter, Rhizobium, Mycorrhizae on this side. You guys might be familiar with some of those names, that they're coming to the root surface, and the root is exuding these different elements, luteolin, palmitic acid, adenine, different amino acids, different phytochemicals, in exchange for whatever the Azotobacter or the other microbe is then kind of transferring to the root. So that's where this exchange is happening at the root site. And there are literally thousands of root exudates. This paper down here, a PubMed publication, you know, scientists have begun to try to understand, like, what is really happening at the surface level of all these roots, and, you know, what's getting pumped in and out and in and out. And it's this constant exchange back and forth. But that's what's going on with root exudates. And as the microbiome is feeding, you know, other nutrition and phytochemicals to the plant, that plant is then able to climb up this plant health pyramid. So a plant is getting, you know, different nutrition and energy from different resources, right? I mean, photosynthesis being one source, the root exudates feeding the microbiome and whatever the microbiome is supplying being another source. And some people don't realize that, you know, the plant begins by wanting to build basic carbohydrates to complete photosynthesis, but then it's trying to build higher and higher levels of compounds. So the next level would be protein. You know, some crops, right, we actually measure their protein content for like feed quality. And so we need everything, all the macronutrients and micronutrients available to complete protein synthesis. And then from there, this is a funny one, right? Fat. Do we really think of plants as having fat? And I remember the first time that I heard of this from John Kempf, he gave the example of a spinach leaf. And you think of like the really shiny or kind of thick, waxy surface of, you know, maybe not your store-bought spinach, but spinach that you get from a local farmer that is really nutrient dense, and you might get that kind of waxy layer. That's actually you know, a phospholipid barrier. There's some lipids there on the surface. So plants do have a fat component to them. And then if they can build all the way up to that, you know, then they're building kind of their immune system, topping it out with different phytonutrient plant protection chemicals, different secondary metabolites. So this is kind of the immunity, the natural immunity. If that plant is building fat and secondary metabolites, we don't need to spray chemicals. We don't need to spray fungicides or insecticides, because the fungus or the insect actually is unable to penetrate that leaf surface or attack the plant. The plant is too healthy for that. And so we think of the fat of the land, this microbiome, you know, that's bringing all this robust nutrition and phytochemicals to the roots, and that's translating all the way up the plant triangle, plant health triangle, that then results in, you know, all of our different food, from fruits and vegetables to feedstocks that are feeding, you know, animals if you are eating animals in your diet. So what's the equivalent on the human health side? This is showing an example of how the microbiome, that we think of the microbiome in the human body as maybe primarily being in the gut, right? If you've ever heard anything on TV or read an article, it's like, oh, the gut microbiome, right? Our digestion system. But what we're discovering from science is that the digestive tract is then connecting to all these different organ systems, and that they're actually calling these different axes of the microbiome reaching out to these different organs, which is just quite fascinating. So the paper that this comes from, if you guys want to look this up later, is this is the title, Human Gut Microbiota and Health and Disease, Unveiling the Relationship. And they're beginning to consider this microbiome as its own organ, forming multi-directional connecting axis with other organs. And so it's, this is way different than my grade school science, right, of what I learned about the digestion tract. I don't even know if we learned about microbes. So we're realizing just how interconnected these systems are, and that most of these the microbiome in our gut is non-pathogenic, right? So it's actually helping to protect us. It's providing immunity to defend against pathogenic invasion, and that dysbiosis, which would be an imbalance of the gut microbiota, is then linked to so many diseases. So it's really not we all have a microbiome, right? But to the degree that you're healthy or not, it's kind of like, what's the balance of your microbiome, of what types of microbes and the diversity of the microbes that are in your gut that are helping to regulate various disease processes that might be happening in the body. And so we have our gut microbiome. We also have our skin microbiome. And knowing that it's not just what's within us, it's also what's on every surface of our body. So it's just, again, it's kind of like mind-boggling or profound. Microbes are on every single surface, thousands of them all the time. And that the health of somebody's skin, if there's an eruption, like a rash or an eczema or a psoriasis or some skin condition that, apparently comes out of nowhere, or we don't know where it came from, that's often an indicator of an underlying condition happening within the gut microbiome. The skin microbiome and the gut microbiome are really connected that way. So I always like to think of that in my own body. If I have a breakout for some reason, I like to think back to, okay, well, what did I eat? Because I know that my internal microbiome is then being expressed in my outward or my skin microbiome. And then the third microbiome, there's, I guess I'm giving you 3 examples of the microbiome in the body, but just remember, we're like so much more microbial cells and genetic material than human cells, and science is just really beginning to bring this to light. Is that kind of this concept of these microbiome clouds, and maybe we all got a little bit more familiar with this with COVID and the 6-foot rule and how we aerosol bacteria and we're constantly breathing. But what I found fascinating was this study here that you guys can look up, is where they followed somebody and the different bacteria surrounding them in their microbiome cloud from their home environment all the way to, like, if they went to work or went to the grocery store, and to see how it changed or interacted in other environments when that person left, like, their home. And what they discovered actually is that, like, the microbes that you have in and around you from what you're breathing in this, like, microbiome cloud stay pretty consistent. So it's kind of like this cloud is, protecting you in terms of, if you have a healthy microbiome internally, we're kind of creating our little sphere, right? People joke about their personal bubbles, but it really is almost like a microbiome bubble that is whatever microbiology is within us is kind of around us in terms of our protection or defense. And that is really, what the human microbiome is in terms of, I would list, like, immunity as number 1 in terms of barriers and protection and wanting to leave, not let bad things in and trying to regulate what's, coming into the environment versus what's allowed. And so you could think about this as the gut or the skin, or even in our little breathing aerosol bubble. But what happens when there is an imbalance, when there is that dysbiosis? And that's where we get inflammation in the body. It's kind of been well proven at this point that inflammation is at the root of practically all known chronic health conditions. And I've listed just a few of them here. I'm not going to give, big, long graphs and studies of how bad some of the chronic disease epidemics are in the US. We probably all know someone who's struggling in some way, from, something like a heart disease or diabetes or cancer, some of these chronic conditions that we didn't used to have really high numbers of them. And this has been in the last several decades, which I would argue with the changes in agriculture and the changes in diet have caused those. But it's been a breakdown of our microbiome in tandem with, our lifestyle practices that's creating this inflammation. So I asked the question, what does inflammation look like in the soil? And, okay, here's inflammation in the human body, and we know what happens when the microbiome in the human body breaks down. But in the soil, this past summer, I walked a lot of compacted fields, a lot of cracked, dried out soil. And I know here we are in Ohio, we've had some different drought conditions and designations across the state in terms of, we did have maybe challenging growing conditions or drought affecting farmers. And at the same time, if we have a really robust and thriving organic matter, or that thriving microbiome under the organic matter, we can have resiliency through stressed, challenged conditions. So I think the inflammation really is compacted, hard soils, monoculture, a lot of what I see in the commodity crop agriculture that I work with. So we have this, plague or situation, right? We're kind of jumping into the middle of the presentation here, where we're talking about the problem. Okay, so our soils are sick and people are sick, and 6 in 10 adults have a chronic condition, and 4 in 10 adults have two conditions, have two or more, and that there's a it's not this 4.1 trillion, but it's the fact that our healthcare spending in the U.S. is over 4.5 times more than our military budget in terms of what the U.S. is spending on healthcare. So it seems like that's more sick care, right? And we really we're going to go bankrupt as a country if we don't do something to address this. And I see both of these, the soil and our human health, being in tandem. We need to address both together. So within soil degradation and the loss of that microbiome, a lot of this is due to the loss of diversity. So here's a farm in 1900 approximately. There was different smaller fields and animals, and maybe you had your orchard or your vegetable garden in the rotation, and all these things were rotating. And then this is a lot of what our farm fields look like today in regard to these large monoculture fields, and just one crop is grown. And I'm not against farmers in any way, right? I love farmers. I work with farmers every day, and I think no matter who's on this call, whether you're a farmer or a consumer who buys food from farmers, we all really need to be working with farmers and recognizing this isn't their fault in terms of the transition from this to this, right? But we need to figure out, how do we create more diversity in this system in order to bring back the soil microbiome in this system. And some of the reasons why we've had losses of soil degradation are listed here on the left. I'm not going to go into any of these in depth, but they're kind of examples of physical degradation, wind or water or tillage. And I also want to draw attention to chemical degradation, because this is a human health presentation, recognizing that our chemical pesticides have potential risks, and definitely recognizing correlation is not causation, but there are certain scientists such as Don Huber listed below who are trying to draw attention to the dangers of certain chemical pesticides like glyphosate. So this slide that I pulled on glyphosate is because it is the highest used herbicide in the industry. And the red line here is showing levels in the urinary tract. The red line here is showing levels of glyphosate applied. And this is, then these bars are tons of glyphosate, and these bars are diagnosis of autism. So they're a little flipped in terms of what the red line means, but it's the fact that these trends are happening together. And I could show you lots of other graphs for different diseases. There's a class action lawsuit against glyphosate with cancer, but it's just wanting to draw to light, how are these farming practices and these pesticides that are killing the soil microbiome also negatively affecting human health as well. And another one that a lot of people, everybody, I shouldn't say everybody, but a lot of people might hear about glyphosate because it has been in the news because of that class action lawsuit. But this is another one, paraquat and Parkinson's. There's a class action lawsuit about this as well. And that farmers have a 2,400 higher incidence than national average of Parkinson's, according to the Ecdysis Foundation. If you guys don't know about the Ecdysis Foundation, this is organization of Jonathan Lundgren, and I would recommend you to check them out because they're really doing a lot of good citizen science, trying to bring some of these trends to light with regenerative practices as well as the health of the farmer. So, just one more slide here. If the potential risk of disease, right, correlation is not causation, but if these things are causing disease, and we might not be able to prove that yet, or, this is in the courts, what we do know very well and what's proven is that these chemical pesticides are tying up micronutrients. So this is the chemical family. The middle column is like the trademark name. And then the element or mineral that is tied up through, the technical term is chelation. And chelation means that that micronutrient or nutrient is held onto like a claw. Chelation is, the root is claw. And so if it's held, it's then not able to be released or utilized by the soil microbes, by the plants, by the plant physiology. So what we have then is a growing environment in which certain macro and micronutrients aren't available. And if those aren't available, then how can that plant really build its most optimal plant health by climbing the plant health pyramid? And if it's not getting into the food, then are our human brains starving due to lack of these micronutrients in our food? So I hope by painting that picture of giving the example of, some of these chemical pesticides, just as a few short examples, and again, like a high level, I'm just planting some seeds for us to think about without doing the deep dive of the science behind all of this. Like, this is how our soil microbiome and farming practices all connect all the way to human health and, what nutrients are in our food. Even if we are trying to eat a really healthy diet, we could still be starving for micronutrients. So switching back over to the human microbiome here, this is a book, Missing Microbes, and there's a lot of different resources out there. This is actually the name of a paper, if you guys wanted to Google this, Disappearance of the Human Microbiota, How We May Be Losing Our Oldest Allies. It's been proven, the science is showing that there is a diminishing or lack of diversity in the human microbiome compared to indigenous populations and our native ancestors that used to have a way more robust microbiome in their primarily in their gut is where they measure it. And so what are some of the reasons why? Are we hygiene too much? Do we have too much antibiotics, antifungals? Anything with the anti or aside is killing the good microbiomes along with the bad microbiomes or germs we're trying to get rid of. And is it also due to lack of challenging our immune systems? If we're indoors, if we're not engaged with nature, if we're not outside, breathing the air and exposing ourselves to more diverse environments than our home or our office, we're kind of diminishing or having less diversity in our personal microbiome. And the microbiome starts all the way from birth. So our first inoculation is with vaginal birth. C-sections are becoming more popular these days, and it's the fact that we know that we're missing out on a huge inoculation if a child is getting a C-section instead of a vaginal birth. Then the next best food, for that baby is breast milk. If the mom's able to breastfeed, they're getting a large amount of microbial inoculation there. And then as little kids, right, are we allowed to crawl and play in the dirt and get dirty and be in soil? And, as a kid, I remember I put a lot of things in my mouth and ate things that I wasn't supposed to. Swallowed a penny or two in my lifetime as a child, right? So I'm curious what the weirdest thing you guys have swallowed in your lives has been. But yeah, it's the fact that we, are we too clean? Are we too enclosed or protecting ourselves from actually the nature that we are, right? And allowing our personal human microbiome to then interface with, dirt and the soil and the air and getting outside from a really young age. This is all generational. And that even they can trace back to the grandmother's microbiome, how that passes all the way to a grandchild, because the eggs of a grandchild that were in the mom, right, actually started in the grandma. So we can trace these microbiome changes or shifts all the way generationally back to generations. So really important that we try to keep it robust and as diverse as possible. And if you somehow got through your childhood unscathed and had a vaginal birth and got to drink breast milk and got to play in the dirt as a kid, we're then faced with, as adults, we're faced with a standard American diet for the rest of our lives. We're constantly receiving, the stresses or the pressures of what are we eating, what are we putting in our body, what is healthy for our microbiome, right? And then we have all these dietary and nutrition decisions to make as an adult. The ones that jump out in terms of, low fruits and vegetables that often have the fiber, and any amount of processed food is kind of diminishing the microbiome. So the more that we can eliminate processed food and increase fresh fruits and vegetables, those are some of the first steps to begin to feed and create more diversity in our personal microbiomes. All right, so here we are with, hope to finish this here in about 10 minutes with focusing in on our solutions. And it is overwhelming when we start to think of the microbiology underpinning everything and how each of our individual and personal choices adds up to affect our microbiome, as well as maybe the microbiomes around us, right? Like the microbiomes of the soil. And so where do we start as we think about solutions? I just want to kind of give us a grounding North Star. And so I'm going to read this quote from Wendell Berry. "The soil is the great connector of lives, the source and destination of all. It is the healer and restorer and resurrector by which disease passes into health, age into youth, death into life. Without proper care for it, we have no community, because without proper care for it, we have no life." And this is Wendell Berry. He wrote in his book, The Unsettling of America. And what I really want to drive home the point here in these last few solution slides is, we are the soil and the soil is us. So anything that's done to the soil is almost like acting that out. It will come back to us as humans, right? In terms of if the soil's not healthy, we as people won't be healthy, because the soil is life. So if we are in agreement that we're sick, or that our soils are sick and people are sick with these chronic health conditions, what's the first thing you do when you're really sick? And the snail here is our clue, right? We want to stop and slow down. And I think that this is something that's really missing in agriculture and missing in culture as a whole. Our ability to take pause, our ability to slow down and breathe deeply. But this is how we're going to be able to create new ways of thinking and new neural pathways in our bodies and minds to be able to tackle these problems. We have to slow down and stop. And so this is the acronym that I offer all of us kind of as a take home. I walk through farm fields and I say this to myself and I share it with my farmers. Okay, what's the problem here? What's the challenge? It's like, okay, are you thinking through AWTF? And it's kind of fun if you guys use kind of like an or A for the A. It's, you could remember it by saying like, what the, right? And you guys can fill in the F. But it helps me remember it, because you could walk through any situation or even an example in your own personal health and be like, what the, and go through this list of your 4 micro needs. So any microbe, whether it's a microbe in our human bodies or a microbe in the soil, needs these four things: air, water, temperature, and food. And I'm going to roll through these individually here. You know, air, the A, is kind of a no-brainer, right? We're not going to live another second if we can't take a breath and breathe. And the same is true for microbes. They need to have this constant air exchange. So in our soil environments or our growing gardens, is that soil breathing? You know, the soil is supposed to be 25% air. So we can test for this through the Haney test and the CO2 burst test, or with the penetrometer, to see what's happening with the air exchange and if there's compaction in the soil with the penetrometer. But we need there to be proper air exchange for the microbes. The same thing with our human bodies, right? Are we taking enough deep breaths? You can actually get a CO2 test on your blood work and see how much you're breathing, or are you holding your breath? Do you meditate? Do you exercise? I'm not going to read through these lists verbatim as I flip through these different slides, but you guys can read the different examples of practices that could help bring more air and oxygenation. And just taking those deep breaths throughout the day, you know, one every hour even. Start with a low-hanging goal. So after air, there's water. And within the soil, we want the soil to be 25% water. And that's allowing room for water to flow, but also allowing room for, you know, the air exchange and root growth. So within the soil, we can test for water infiltration. We can do root digs to see how the roots are digging. We want them to grow down and not sideways. And then we can evaluate, you know, for a farmer or gardener, what sort of fertilizers you're using that may or may not affect water. High salt will attract water, so that'll limit the availability of the microbiology. And then with humans, you know, maybe we don't think about it enough, like how much water am I drinking throughout a day? What's the source of my water? Is my water clean? Does it have any toxins in it, you know, that I'm unaware of? This is a site from EWG, is the Environmental Working Group, and you can click on this, or type it in, and you can look up your water quality by zip code and kind of know if you would need to do any sort of filtering in your house for water remediation. I mean, we are 60% water as humans, and if someone were dealing with a health crisis, the water and the source of their water would be one of the first places that we would want to look as terrain advocates. Terrain advocates like myself, we would want to evaluate their water source to make sure it's clean and pure. So the third letter T is for temp, you know, I have it as the temperature, but I really think of it as like the shelter of the environment, or what's this overarching environment that the soil microbe is in. In the soil, the temperature that we want is 50 to 80 degrees. So in the winter, you know, the microbes go to sleep because it's below 50 degrees. When it gets really, really hot in the summer, they also go to sleep. So it's not that they go away or disappear. It's just, you know, slower function, kind of like how we get slower in winter maybe, or when it's really, really hot outside. So the ways that we can mitigate for temperature are with, is the soil covered year round? Are there cover crops? You know, keep the soil covered, have something green growing, and are we protecting those soil aggregates, or the house of the soil that I mentioned earlier, by limiting tillage? With the human microbiome, I put here Maslow's hierarchy of needs in terms of our shelter and our bodies. Like, our microbes in our human bodies are sensing everything, right? So maybe you have enough air to breathe and enough water. We haven't gotten to food yet, but you know, they can sense if you're unsafe. They can sense if you're in a violent or an abusive relationship. They can sense if you're really anxious about the news or, you know, social media or something like this, right? I mean, this is where we want to be taking care of ourselves as whole people and realizing that our microbes are tapping into these different aspects of us as people. So the F, the food is last, and it's interesting because, you know, we can survive a long time with just, you know, maybe air and water and minimal food. And fasting is actually a pretty healthy practice for human health and for overcoming a chronic health condition in the human body. But in terms of feeding foods for our soil microbiome and really the variety of foods feeds the variety of microbes, whether it's in the soil or in the human. So think diversity, diversity, diversity. And the more different foods we feed, the more different microbes, the more robust that organic matter and that stable organic matter really will be in the growing system. So these are several examples here under the soil and under the human. You know, I mentioned a little bit of these earlier with the fruits and vegetables providing fiber. But think about other creative ways with exercise, really stimulates your gut microbiome, as well as like, what are you feeding your mind and your body and your spirit? There's all these different aspects of who we are, and the microbes in us are connecting to anything that we're experiencing. It could be, like I mentioned, social media earlier. It could be the music we're listening to. It could be how tense we are while driving our car. You know, it could be what we're looking at. All of this is information that we're feeding our personal microbiomes. So I added a few others outside of the what the acronym. And so I mentioned the chemical pesticides earlier. It's important to recognize where we're having previous exposures and if a human health condition, you know, might be connected to toxic exposure. In the soil, we can test our water or soils for pestidue residues, and these are 2 labs. You know, for a person with their personal microbiome, the terrain practitioner network, the terrain doctors, as a terrain advocate, I work with a terrain doctor. So, you know, I'm not a medical practitioner. I don't diagnose or prescribe, but the doctors can order blood work and make detox protocols. And so this test, assess, and address is really coming from Dr. Nacia Winters, and her approach, she calls it the Terrain 10, in which there are these 10 buckets of health that she goes through in evaluating someone's condition. You know, she does a lot with cancer, and that's, you know, the metabolic approach to cancer is the book that she wrote, but it could be, you know, the metabolic approach to any disease condition, because metabolic drivers and inflammation are really what's underneath any chronic disease. So I just share this. You guys can learn more about her at drnacia.com or mtah.org. And remember, we're not alone. This call, I know we're all on Zoom here, so we all might be in our individual environments, but we're really like mycorrhizae underneath the soil, and we're always connected. I believe the call was this webinar, you know, with the Nature Conservancy as well as with OFA for Ohio Soil Health Week. You know, there's lots of events, there's lots of people, there's lots of resources out here for us. Talk to, you know, trusted family member or friend or pastor. Recognize that we're always connected to source. If you guys want to follow up with me as a resource, you're more than welcome to do that as well. And for all of this, I guess I would just encourage that, you know, the soil microbiome or our personal human microbiome, this didn't happen overnight. These have been degrading for a while. And so we need to think about the long game in terms of how we're building them back. We can take steps every day or every month or every year, you know, depending on your short-term goals and short-term, you know, growing cycles for a farmer, or recognizing a farmer has to make money every year, right? You're thinking short-term. But if we can think more of this long-term or the generational, and what are we leaving for our children, maybe with the soil, we want to think about longer-term solutions such as organic no-till, pasture-based systems. Believe it or not, there's robots that they're coming up with as these weeders, so that maybe we don't have to spray chemicals as herbicides to control for weeds. So lots of different things that we have yet to know are on the horizon. And with people, you know, if you guys are struggling with anything, there's something called the Terrain 10 survey through Dr. Nacia Winters that I could share with you, as well as connect you with a metabolic terrain doctor. But really generationally, we're talking about microbiomes. We're talking about, you know, these microbes, right? Soil microbiome, human microbiome. And I really like to drive it home here with just recognizing that, yeah, we're talking about microbes, but microbes are life. This is really about life. And we do this through more life. So you put a little bit back into life, and life comes back to you with more life. This is my belief, or it's been my experience in my life. So I leave you with this quote from Andreas Weber. He's a eco-philosopher, a really beautiful human being. It is not about me wanting to feel as much life as I can, but about giving life. That is our deepest desire and is the desire of the world itself. So just keep that in mind as we're, tackling these really big topics of microbiomes and maybe the overwhelming nature of all this. We just keep feeding and giving back to life, and life will give back to us. And that's the microbiome underpinning everything. So this is my contact information. You guys are welcome to contact me